It started with a bright orange notice on my garage, or maybe it started long before that, when a corrupt HOA president decided she could intimidate anyone who didn't fit her perfect picture of the neighborhood. She thought towing my bike would be the end of it. What she didn't know, that bike belonged to the future CEO of Harley-Davidson. What came next wasn't just a fight over a motorcycle. It turned into a full-on war against greed, abuse of power, and the people who thought they were untouchable. And let me tell you, justice rumbled louder than any engine they ever tried to silence. You're not going to want to miss how this one ends. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. This story's got everything: betrayal, community, and a whole lot of karma. Let's ride. I'd only been gone a few days, just a quick trip down to Texas to check in on my dad. He's been getting older, slowing down more lately, and I needed to see him face to face. The drive back was long, but peaceful, the kind of solitude that helps you clear your mind. I pulled into my quiet suburban neighborhood right as the sun was dipping low, casting a soft orange glow over the rooftops. It should have been a calming sight, but the moment my tires hit my driveway, that calm vanished. There, flapping in the evening breeze like a neon slap to the face, was a big orange notice taped to my garage door. I sat there for a second, engine still running, just staring at it. My stomach dropped. I already knew what it was before I even stepped out of the truck. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag, and walked slowly toward the garage, each step heavier than the last. Notice of violation. It read in bold letters across the top. Below that, unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove motorcycle within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. And in handwriting so perfect it looked computer printed, someone had added, motorcycles reduce property values and attract an undesirable element to our community. I didn't even have to guess who it was from. That had Linda Ackerman written all over it. I'd only lived in this neighborhood for 6 months, but I'd already crossed paths with her twice, both times ending with a sour taste in my mouth. First time, she rang my doorbell at 6:45 a.m. on a Saturday to scold me about my trash bins being visible from the street. The second time, she flagged me down while I was washing my Harley in the driveway, telling me I was setting a dangerous precedent. Whatever that meant. Linda wasn't just a nosy neighbor, she was the self-declared queen of our HOA. Middle-aged, stiff posture, always in a power walking outfit like she was going to war with carbohydrates. Her hair never moved, not even in windstorms. And she had a way of talking that made everything sound like a rule, even when it wasn't. I turned and looked at my bike, parked neatly right beside the garage. A 2024 Harley-Davidson Pan America 1250, in perfect condition, polished and gleaming like a museum piece. I'd worked hard for that bike, spent years saving, picking out every custom part myself. She wasn't some nuisance vehicle. She was the result of a lifetime of sweat, sacrifice, and a little bit of rebellion left in me. Kids in the neighborhood loved that bike. Even Mr. Alvarez from across the street used to bring his grandson over to admire it. It had become part of the community in its own way, at least to everyone who didn't think a chrome engine was a threat to real estate. But this was different. Something about it felt personal. Not just a generic warning, but a challenge. The word undesirable stuck with me like a bad smell. And the timing coming back from my trip, with no way to contest it while I was away, felt deliberate, calculated. I stood there in the fading light, holding the notice in my hand, feeling that familiar burn rise in my chest. Anger, sure, but deeper than that. A kind of betrayal. I followed the rules. My lawn was always trimmed. Trash was taken out on the right day. And that bike? Parked well within my property line. Always clean, always quiet. I knew the HOA bylaws, backwards and forwards. Nowhere did it say anything about motorcycles being banned. Linda was overstepping, and she knew it. I took out my phone and started snapping pictures, the notice, the bike, the driveway, everything. I wasn't just documenting this for the HOA. I was documenting it for the storm I could already feel coming. Because what Linda didn't know, what nobody in this neighborhood knew, was that I'd just accepted a new role. One that was going public in less than a week. CEO of Harley-Davidson. Yeah, that undesirable element she was so worried about. Turns out I run it. But for now, I kept that detail to myself. Let her play her games. Let her think I was just some blue-collar guy with a loud bike and an attitude. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Yet. I barely slept that night. The orange notice sat on my kitchen counter like a taunt. Every time I walked past it, I had to resist the urge to crumple it up and throw it in the trash. But I needed it. Evidence. Proof that something wasn't right. It wasn't just about the bike. It was about Linda Ackerman, our HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of order and aesthetics in the neighborhood, and her crusade against anything that didn't fit into her pastel-colored version of suburban paradise. I'd seen power-hungry people before. Back in the early days of my career, I'd worked with some of the most aggressive corporate ladder climbers imaginable. But Linda, she wasn't just trying to keep lawns trimmed. She was running a miniature dictatorship, and most people didn't even notice. The next morning, I took my coffee out to the front porch and watched the neighborhood come to life. Joggers, dog walkers, retirees with their newspapers tucked under their arms. It looked normal, peaceful even, but I couldn't stop scanning the street for her Linda, and right on cue, she appeared. There she was, marching down the sidewalk like she owned the pavement. Black yoga pants, bright pink track jacket, and that ever-present clipboard in hand. Her hair was pulled into a bun so tight, it looked like it hurt. She made a beeline for the corner where the Johnsons had planted a small flower bed, stopped, bent over like a detective at a crime scene, and scribbled something furiously on her notepad. She hadn't seen me yet. Or maybe she had and just didn't care. I stood up and stepped off the porch. "Morning, Linda," I called out, trying to keep my tone neutral. She glanced over, squinted, then gave a thin-lipped smile. "Good morning, Mr. Zaid." That's what she called me, Mr. Zaid. Never my first name. She said it like she was addressing a parking ticket. We both knew there was no friendliness behind it. I walked down the path toward her. About that notice on my garage, she cut me off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. The rules are clear. Recreational vehicles are not to be stored in driveways. Page 47 of the HOA guidelines. "That bike isn't a recreational vehicle," I said calmly. "It's my primary transportation. I use it daily." "Then store it in your garage," she snapped back. "Our community has certain standards, Mr. Zaid. We've worked hard to maintain the property values here. I've read the bylaws. There's nothing in there banning motorcycles. I've gone through the entire document." "That's because it was updated last month," she said, her eyes narrowing just a bit. "You would have received the new version by mail. Perhaps you were away?" So she did time it on purpose. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper, but I could feel it building, low in my chest, like a simmering pot. "This isn't about community standards," I said. "You've had a problem with me since I moved in." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're referring to. First, it was the trash bins, then the grass. Then the paint color on my fence wasn't in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. And now the bike. You don't enforce the rules, you invent them." Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Some people are better suited to living in more flexible environments. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable elsewhere." There it was, not even subtle. "Let me guess," I said. "You'd love to see me leave. Sell my place. Make room for someone who drives a Prius and doesn't make any noise." She didn't deny it. She just looked past me, as if the conversation was over, and started walking away. But she couldn't help herself. She paused, turned, and added, "Your little toy makes quite the racket on weekend mornings." "My husband says it wakes him up." I didn't answer. I just watched her go. It wasn't just a personal grudge. Linda had an agenda, and she was willing to twist the rules or flat out create new ones to push out anyone who didn't fit her mold. And from what I'd seen, no one on the HOA board had the spine to challenge her. Most of them were friends, or at least under her thumb. Her brother-in-law, Hank, had recently started a towing company, Ackerman Recovery Services. The name had just popped up on some of the neighborhood group chats. People were whispering about rising towing fees, new parking restrictions, but no one had connected the dots yet. Not until now. That night, I pulled up the HOA portal on my laptop and started digging. The PDF of the updated bylaws was dated just 3 weeks ago. There was indeed a new clause about recreational vehicles, but it was vague. It didn't mention motorcycles by name, and there was no record of a community vote, which was required by law for bylaw changes. Linda had slipped it in, quietly, illegally. I leaned back in my chair, heart thumping. She'd gotten away with it for a while, maybe even believed she was untouchable, but she wasn't, because what she didn't know was that I'd spent my entire career building companies, dismantling problems, and leading teams through fire. And now I had a whole different kind of fire to walk through, and I wasn't planning on doing it quietly. Linda Ackerman had picked the wrong man to mess with. The next few days felt like a blur, but not the kind that fades. More like the kind that sharpens everything. Every interaction, every email from the HOA, every sideways glance from a neighbor. It all started to click together, like puzzle pieces I hadn't even known were on the table. I kept my cool on the outside, took my walks, waved at folks, mowed the lawn. But every night I was in front of my computer, digging. It started with the towing clause. I reread the updated HOA document half a dozen times. The language was deliberately vague, just enough to sound official, but open to all kinds of interpretation. It mentioned non-standard vehicles and property-enhancing aesthetics, but nowhere did it actually ban motorcycles. And there was no signature page from the board, no community vote log. That's not how amendments are supposed to work. One searched our HOA site for past newsletters, notices, meeting minutes. There was nothing referencing the bylaw update prior to the day I got that orange notice. It had just appeared unannounced like a trap, laid in silence. I checked the file metadata. The PDF had been uploaded by Linda herself, and the upload date was exactly 5 days before I left for Texas. 5 days. She knew I wouldn't be around to see it. And it wasn't just me. As I started looking through old emails and posts on our neighborhood message board, I noticed a pattern small at first. A guy 2 blocks over had complained about his classic pickup being towed for aesthetic violations. A single mother at the edge of the cul-de-sac had her trailer taken when her husband was deployed overseas. She'd said something about never getting a proper hearing before the fine hit her account. But no one ever followed up. It was chalked up to unfortunate misunderstandings. I started writing it all down. Dates, names, quotes from the HOA messages. I mapped out the towing reports like a crime scene, and one name kept coming up again and again. Hank Foster, Linda's brother-in-law, and the newly minted owner of Ackerman Recovery Services. Just months ago, the guy was selling insurance out of a shared office space on the interstate. Now he had a fleet of 3 tow trucks and the exclusive contract to handle all HOA vehicle compliance. The more I looked, the more brazen it all seemed. The timing was always the same. A notice appears while the homeowner is away, then a tow happens before they even return. The storage fees? Astronomical. $500 for the tow. Another $150 per day for impound. And if you couldn't pay, the vehicle was declared abandoned and auctioned off quietly, without any public listing. All perfectly legal looking, until you scratch the surface. Linda, Hank, and whoever else they had looped in, they weren't just enforcing rules. They were profiting, and they were doing it by targeting people who wouldn't or couldn't fight back. Elderly homeowners, single parents, veterans, People who didn't have the time, the resources, or the energy to challenge a carefully manipulated system. I stayed up late that night reviewing public business filings. Took a while, but I finally found it. Ackerman Recovery Services had been incorporated just 5 months ago. The registered address? A small office suite on the other side of town. I pulled it up on Google Street View. It was inside a real estate office. And not just any real estate office. Linda's. That was it. The smoking gun. I stared at the screen for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard. I'd been suspicious. Now I was certain. They'd created a full loop. Linda changes the rules, Hank tows the cars, and together they profit from the fear and confusion they create, all under the pretense of protecting community standards. The next morning, I drove past Hank's supposed towing facility. It was little more than a fenced lot next to a rundown mechanic's shop, with rusted signage and one camera pointed at the gate. If my Harley was in there, it was being treated like junk, and I wasn't going to stand for that. On the drive home, I made a decision. It was time to stop documenting and start acting. I wasn't just going to get my bike back. I was going to drag every crooked board member, every fake fee, every shady policy into the sunlight and let the truth speak louder than their rules ever could. They thought they could intimidate me, treat me like I was just another neighbor with a loud engine and no connections. But I had something they didn't know about: experience, resources. And about a week before the rest of the world would find out, I was the next CEO of Harley-Davidson. I pulled into my driveway and stood there for a moment, looking at the empty spot where my bike used to be. Then I pulled out my phone and called an old friend, someone who owed me a favor from the early days. "You still working that back door into public records?" I asked. He laughed. "For you? Always." This was just the beginning. It was just past 5 a.m. when my security camera app buzzed on my phone, jolting me out of sleep. I don't know why I checked it. I almost didn't, but some part of me must have known what was coming. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, blinked to clear the sleep from my eyes, and opened the live feed. There it was, headlights sweeping across my driveway. Then the unmistakable silhouette of a tow truck, backing in slowly, deliberately, like a predator circling its prey. My heart shot into my throat. I leapt out of bed, pulled on jeans and a hoodie, and sprinted for the front door barefoot. The chill of the early morning hit me like a slap in the face as I threw it open. I bolted across the lawn, waving my arms and yelling, "Hey, stop! That's my bike!" The driver didn't even flinch. The truck's rear rig had already lifted my Harley off the ground. It was chained and halfway rolled up onto the flatbed before I even got to the sidewalk. In the dim streetlight, I caught a glimpse of the logo on the side of the truck, Ackerman Recovery Services. Of course, I kept running, but by the time I got halfway down the street, the truck took a hard left and disappeared into the dark. I stood there, panting, fists clenched, watching my bike vanish into the early morning silence. A piece of me was gone with it. And then my phone buzzed again, this time with a text message. It was from Linda. Per HOA regulations, unauthorized vehicle has been removed. HOA office open at 9 a.m. for inquiries. It wasn't even 6 a.m. yet. She'd planned it down to the minute. She knew I'd be asleep, she knew I couldn't stop it, and she had the nerve to text me like it was a damn customer service announcement. I stood in my driveway for a long time, staring at the empty space where my Harley used to sit. My palms were shaking, not from the cold, but from rage. They'd taken it, she had taken it, and she thought I'd just roll over and accept it like every other poor soul she'd pushed around in this neighborhood. No, not this time. At 8:58, I walked into the HOA office with every intention of staying calm. I'd shaved, put on a button-up shirt, even combed my hair. I wanted her to see me not as some biker stereotype, but as a professional, someone she'd underestimated in every possible way. Linda sat behind the desk like a monarch on her throne. Pearl necklace, designer glasses, fake smile. Her office smelled like cinnamon-scented air freshener and self-righteousness. And in the corner, lounging like he owned the place, was her brother-in-law, Hank. He tossed a ring of tow truck keys in the air and caught them without looking. Mr. Zaid, Linda said, not glancing up from her computer. We've been expecting you. She slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside was a highlighted copy of the bylaw she claimed gave her the right to remove my bike, Article 6, Section 9, or something equally generic sounding. This is ridiculous, I said, setting the folder down without even opening it. That bike is my property. You had no right, actually. We did, she interrupted, adjusting her glasses. According to the latest HOA policy update, which was slipped in without a vote, I cut in. I've checked. I know the process. That bylaw wasn't properly added, and even if it was, your notice said 48 hours. That was less than 12. Linda smiled, but it was thinner this time, forced. You're welcome to dispute the charge, she said sweetly, but in the meantime, your vehicle is being held at our authorized facility. Let me guess, $500 to get it back? Plus a daily storage fee? Hank chuckled from the corner. Cash only, he said, flashing a smirk that made my blood boil. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the folder and the paperwork inside. Photography isn't allowed in the HOA office, Linda said sharply. Is that written anywhere? I replied, still clicking. They didn't answer, and they didn't need to, because they knew deep down they were pushing boundaries, dancing just on the edge of what was legal. But that was the thing about bullies like Linda. They never think the guy they're picking on might hit back harder. I left without another word. As I walked out, I saw the office's security camera mounted in the corner. I made a mental note. Something told me it had captured some interesting footage over the last few weeks, maybe even that morning. In my car, I opened the folder again. The bylaw they cited had a revision date from last month, conveniently timed just before I left for Texas. But what really stood out was the address of the impound lot. It was the same as the property Linda had helped Hank buy last year when he got his towing license. It wasn't just a coincidence. I clenched the steering wheel, breathing slowly, letting the fire in my chest settle into something colder, more useful resolve. They thought this was over, but I was just getting started. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in my home office, lights off, laptop open, with nothing but the blue glow of the screen reflecting off the window. Outside, the street was still and quiet, like the whole neighborhood was asleep under Linda's spell. But I couldn't rest. Not while my Harley sat behind a chain-link fence on some shady lot. Not while a smug woman in pearls and a glorified tow truck driver made a mockery of the law. So I started digging. I pulled up everything I could find on our HOA meeting minutes. Board rosters, budgets, expense reports. It wasn't easy. The HOA website wasn't exactly designed for transparency, but I'd spent years navigating corporate black holes and bloated spreadsheets. If there were answers in here, I was going to find them. And sure enough, buried in a set of quarterly reports, I found my first red flag. The HOA's towing expenses had tripled in the last 6 months. Triple. That kind of jump doesn't happen unless something changes, and fast. I checked the invoices. All of them were from Ackerman Recovery Services. Every single one. No bids, no comparison vendors, no public discussion at board meetings. Just a quiet shift in vendors, followed by a sudden spike in vehicle enforcement activity. It didn't stop there. The towing fees listed on the invoices were far higher than what the county allowed. I double-checked the municipal code. Standard towing fee was capped at $250. Ackerman Recovery was charging $500 minimum, plus daily storage, release processing, and even something called a community compliance surcharge. It was highway robbery just dressed up in official language. And guess who signed off on all the invoices? Linda? I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. This wasn't just a policy disagreement or some overzealous enforcement. This was a racket. They weren't enforcing rules. They were monetizing them. And the victims? People who didn't have the energy or resources to fight back. I remembered Velma down the block, mid-70s, retired nurse. Her husband had passed last year, She'd parked her old Ford Ranger in the same spot for decades, but a month ago it vanished overnight. She said she thought it was stolen. Now I wasn't so sure. Or Mr. DeMarco, the widower with the restored '67 Mustang, who suddenly moved out last month after financial troubles. I thought it was odd at the time. Now it made perfect sense. I jotted down every name I could remember. Every neighbor who'd lost a vehicle, moved suddenly, or complained about unfair fees. It wasn't just coincidence. It was a pattern. Target, Tau, charge impossible fees. If they couldn't pay, sell their car at auction. And sometimes buy their house, too. That's when I found something that made my stomach twist. 3 properties' recent sales, all well below market value. I looked up the buyers. Each property was purchased through an LLC called Whisper Oaks Holdings. One quick business registry search later, I had the answer. The registered agent for Whisper Oaks? Linda Ackerman. I sat there stunned for a moment, staring at the screen. She wasn't just trying to get rid of undesirable elements. She was manufacturing them, orchestrating the circumstances, then stepping in to benefit from the fallout. It was predatory, calculated, and it had probably been going on for longer than I knew. By 7 a.m., I'd compiled a full binder of documents, scans of the invoices, screenshots of the website, copies of the bylaw revisions, public records for the property purchases. I wanted to make sure that if I got hit by a bus that day, someone would still have enough to burn Linda's little empire to the ground. I needed confirmation from someone inside the system, someone who could tell me if this went even deeper than I feared. So I called Sarah Wu. Sarah worked at the county clerk's office, and we'd bonded months ago over a shared love of vintage motorcycles. She was sharp, detail-oriented, and more importantly, she hated bullies. I asked her if I could stop by, said I had a weird HOA situation I was trying to make sense of. She agreed to meet during her break. 30 minutes later, I was in her cramped office surrounded by filing cabinets and stale coffee. She looked over my documents without saying a word. Then she pulled up her own system and began cross-checking a few things. After about 10 minutes, she swiveled her chair toward me with a look that said, "You're not going to like this. Your HOA switched banking institutions 6 months ago," she said. "That's not unusual. What is unusual is that they moved the accounts to a small private bank where a guy named Hank Foster, your towing guy, sits on the advisory board." I exhaled slowly. Sarah kept going. "That same bank handles vehicle auction deposits. And get this, there are no proper notices on file for the last dozen vehicle auctions. It's supposed to be public record. Nothing's there. You're telling me they're selling impounded vehicles completely off the books?" She nodded. "At best, it's shady. At worst, it's criminal." I wasn't even surprised anymore, just more resolved. Then she hit me with the big one. Whisper Oaks Holdings isn't just Linda. Her husband is listed as co-manager. And Hank? He's the third. They were all in on it. A closed loop of profit and silence. Towing, fees, auctions, foreclosures, are real estate flips. And it all hinged on one thing, nobody pushing back. Until now. I thanked Sarah and left with certified copies of every record she could legally release. As I stepped outside into the bright mid-morning sun, something strange happened. I smiled, because now I had something they didn't. Evidence, witnesses, and a platform. My title wasn't public yet, but soon the whole world would know. I was the incoming CEO of Harley-Davidson. And when that announcement hit, Linda's undesirable element would become the face of the very company she looked down on. They thought they were clever, hiding behind technicalities and fine print. But now the fine print had a flashlight on it, and I was done being polite. I drove home slower than usual, my mind racing with everything Sarah had shown me. The neighborhood looked the same on the surface, neatly trimmed lawns, kids riding scooters, flags fluttering gently on porches. But now I could see the cracks underneath. What looked like peaceful suburbia was really a well-dressed scam. And the worst part? No one was talking about it. Not because they didn't care, but because they were scared. I pulled into my driveway and sat there for a minute with the engine off, staring at the empty space where my Harley used to sit. The silence was deafening. That bike wasn't just a machine. It was freedom, identity, legacy. And now it was a symbol of everything Linda and her crew thought they could take without consequence. I didn't want revenge. Not really. What I wanted was justice. And the first step toward that was making sure I wasn't the only one telling this story. So I started knocking on doors. I went to see Velma first. She lived 2 houses down, in a little blue bungalow with flower boxes under every window. Her husband had been a Navy mechanic. Her front porch still flew the American flag he was buried with. When she answered, her face lit up, then dimmed when I brought up the subject. "Can I ask what happened to your truck?" I said gently. She hesitated, then stepped aside and let me in. The living room smelled like old books and lemon oil. On the coffee table, a framed photo of her and her husband standing proudly in front of that old Ford Ranger. "It was gone when I got back from church," she said softly, sitting in a worn armchair. "I called the police. They said it had been towed. But the fees, I couldn't afford them." "How much?" "Almost $800. For a 20-year-old truck. I just let it go. Didn't have a choice." I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "You weren't the only one, Velma." Over the next 2 days, I talked to 10 more neighbors. Same story, different details. The Garcia's parents of 3 had their restored Triumph motorcycle towed while they were on vacation. Their daughter was saving it for her wedding gift. Gone. The Martinezes lost their work van. The Patels, their son's first car, towed during his graduation week. And every single one of them had paid Linda's ridiculous fines. Or worse, lost something they could never replace. What made it worse wasn't just the money, it was the shame, the fear. They all thought it was somehow their fault, that they had missed a memo or broken a rule they didn't understand. That maybe they'd let their community down, but they hadn't. They were victims. It made my blood boil, but I kept my composure, because I knew this wasn't about just me anymore. This was about all of us. So I started collecting stories, not just hearsay, actual documentation. I asked for copies of violation notices, receipts, emails, texts from Linda or Hank. Most people were hesitant at first. They were worried about retaliation. Linda had a way of making people feel like she was always watching. And if you spoke up, you'd regret it. So I offered something in return. Transparency. I showed them what I'd found, proof of the inflated fees, the forged bylaw changes, the kickbacks, and the shell companies. I told them who I really was and what I planned to do. Most of them were stunned. A few cried, but every one of them thanked me. By Friday night, I had a manila folder 2 inches thick, filled with enough evidence to sink a small government. And I knew exactly who needed to see it next. I called Jane Wong, a local investigative reporter who'd earned her stripes digging into corrupt city councilmen and shady developers. We'd crossed paths once before during a public policy panel in Chicago. She was smart, relentless, and allergic to corporate spin. If anyone could get this story into the sunlight, it was Jane. When I told her what I had, she didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in the morning." Before I went to bed that night, I looked through the security footage from my house again. It was hard to watch. My Harley being hauled off in the dark like stolen property. Hank not even blinking as he backed into my driveway. But then I noticed something new. Margaret, Linda's best friend and HOA board member, walking up the street, 15 minutes before the tow truck arrived. She looked around, then snapped a photo of my house on her phone. She'd been the lookout. Part of the setup. I added the footage to the file. The next morning, Jane showed up with a camera crew and a voice recorder. We sat in my living room for 3 hours while I laid everything out. The stories, the documents, the network of fraud. By the time we finished, her notebook was filled cover to cover. "This is bigger than HOA abuse," she said. This is organized theft. Exactly, I said. And it's been hiding behind landscaping rules and architectural committees. We both sat there for a moment, the weight of it sinking in. Then she looked at me and smiled. Let's blow it up. Before she left, I handed her a thumb drive with copies of every document, every photo, every frame of security footage. That night, I sent a confidential email to the rest of the HOA board minus Linda, Hank, and Margaret. I told them I had reason to believe major financial misconduct was taking place under their leadership. I attached a few sanitized examples and offered to meet privately. Within the hour, I got 3 responses. All of them said the same thing. We've suspected for a while, but we were afraid to say anything. Now, they weren't afraid, and neither was I, because I knew what was coming next. Not a lawsuit, not even an internal vote. It was something louder, something stronger, a rally, a show of force not just of bikers, but of neighbors, veterans, families, workers, everyone who'd ever been told to follow the rules, while someone else rewrote them in secret. Linda wanted to control the narrative, but now the community had a different story to tell, and it was finally time we told it together. By Sunday morning, the fuse was lit. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. I had the receipts literally. Bank records, forged bylaw revisions, impound slips with inflated fees, emails with veiled threats, and interviews with a dozen residents who'd been wronged. Jane Wong was preparing her story. The HOA board minus the inner circle was rattled but willing to listen. What I needed now wasn't more evidence. What I needed was pressure, real pressure, public. So I made some calls. First, I reached out to Ray Martinez, the president of the State Motorcycle Rights Association. We hadn't talked since last year when I quietly helped fund their legal challenge to a state helmet law that had been unfairly punishing riders. He owed me one. When I told him what happened, how my bike had been illegally towed, and how it was part of a larger scheme targeting seniors and families, his voice changed. "You want us to show up?" he asked. "I want everyone to show up." He didn't ask questions after that. Within 2 hours, I had emails and phone calls pouring in from motorcycle clubs across the state, veterans, law enforcement retirees, women's riding groups, classic bike enthusiasts, even a few Harley dealerships. Word spread fast. People were pissed. What happened to me wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a shot at the whole riding community. And when you come after one of us, you come after all of us. We picked Saturday as the day of the rally. I secured the permits with help from one of the HOA board members, Susan, a retired teacher who'd grown tired of Linda's antics years ago, but never had the leverage to challenge her. She was more than happy to help now. The rally wouldn't just be about the bike. It would be a show of unity, of resistance, and above all, of exposure. We weren't going to play dirty. We were going to play legal, loud, and right in front of the cameras. Flyers went out quietly through social media, private message boards, email lists. No HOA-wide announcements. We didn't want to give Linda time to react, at least not until it was too late. Meanwhile, I kept the pressure on behind the scenes. I mailed a cease and desist letter to the HOA's general inbox with my legal team's letterhead across the top. The letter demanded the return of my property, cited specific violations of state towing statutes, and included a not-so-subtle note that any attempt to sell or destroy my motorcycle would be considered criminal theft. The next morning, I received a hand-delivered envelope via uniformed courier. Inside was an invoice, $4,500 in towing and storage fees, and a single note from Linda, written in her usual cursive perfection. "Rules are rules, Mr. Zaid. Payment required within 24 hours. What she didn't realize is that she'd made a critical mistake. The bank account on the invoice? It was different from the one listed in the previous invoices I'd collected. A little digging revealed that the account number traced back not to Ackerman Recovery Services or even the HOA, but to a limited liability company registered to Linda's husband, a private entity. one with no right to collect HOA funds, let alone enforce fines. She wasn't just corrupt, she was sloppy. That night, I scanned the invoice, circled the account number, and sent it to Jane. The headline practically wrote itself. By Wednesday, I had the final puzzle pieces in place. I visited the Garcias, the elderly couple, who lost their vintage Triumph. I'd spoken to them before, but now I brought evidence, the towing records and financial documents proving their bike was taken under false pretenses and sold without proper notice. The old man, Miguel, nearly broke down. That bike, it was my wedding gift to my wife, 43 years ago. His wife, Rosa, squeezed his hand and looked me dead in the eye. We trusted them. I nodded. So did everyone. That's how they got away with it. Before I left, Miguel walked me to the door and placed a small metal key in my hand. It's the old garage. Hasn't been touched since the bike was taken. If you can get it back, I'll do my best, I promised. Thursday morning, I visited Kevin Chen. His grandmother had lost gardening equipment worth hundreds when her small shed was mysteriously deemed non-compliant and removed by order of the HOA. Kevin worked part-time at the courthouse records department. Quiet kid. Smart. Honest. He met me at his front porch with a thick envelope. "You didn't get this from me," he said, glancing around. Inside were photocopies of HOA filings that had never been made public. They showed a pattern vehicle auctions conducted without permits, without notifications, and without legal observers. All proceeds funneled into accounts tied to Whisper Oaks Holdings. "Thanks, Kevin. I just want them to stop," he said. Friday night, I stood in my garage, what used to be my sanctuary, surrounded by maps, legal pads, photos, and printouts taped to the walls. It looked like a crime board from a detective show. My Harley wasn't here, but its spirit was. And it wasn't just about the bike anymore. It was about neighbors, integrity, community. I looked down at a list of confirmed attendees for the rally. Over 300 riders had RSVP'd. Some were coming in from out of state. A few big-name journalists had caught wind of the event. The story was no longer just local. It was going to explode. I picked up the phone and called my assistant, Maria, back at Harley-Davidson HQ. "Hey," I said, "I need you to move up the press release. About your promotion?" "Yeah." "Drop it Saturday morning, 9 a.m. sharp." There was a pause. "You sure?" "We were waiting for, I'm sure. Trust me, timing's everything." That night, I slept soundly for the first time in days, because the moment was finally here, and Linda had no idea what was about to roll down her street. Saturday morning dawned cool and clear. The sky was a soft shade of blue, cloudless and wide open, like it knew something big was about to happen. I stood on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood wake up. Birds chirped. Sprinklers ticked on in perfect suburban harmony. A dog barked in the distance. All of it so normal, eerily normal given what was coming. At exactly 8:00 a.m. I heard it. A low rumble. Not thunder, not a truck. Something different, deeper, familiar. Engines. Dozens of them. I stepped to the edge of my lawn, just as the first wave of motorcycles turned onto our main street, chrome glinting in the morning sun, headlights glowing like quiet judgment. Leading the pack was the Veterans Motorcycle Club, each rider in matching leather vests and patches worn with pride. Behind them came the Ladies of Chrome, a fierce group of women with bright pink helmets and flag decals fluttering from their bikes. Then the classic riders, the street souls, and group after group, each with their own rhythm but united in purpose. They came in silence at first, no revving, no grandstanding, just quiet, orderly arrival, one after another, until the entire street was lined with bikes. They parked only in legal spots. No one gave Linda or her rules the satisfaction of chaos. They came prepared, informed, and organized. By 8:15, the sidewalks were full. Kids were peeking out windows. Elderly neighbors were dragging out lawn chairs to watch. Families stepped onto porches, rubbing their eyes at the sight of hundreds of motorcycles transforming our quiet neighborhood into something electric. Linda appeared 5 minutes later. She stepped out of her front door wearing a silk bathrobe and fluffy slippers, her hair still wrapped in curlers. She held a hose in one hand like she'd been watering her roses when the first bike rolled by, but the hose was already forgotten, dangling limply as she stared, slack-jawed. I could see the color draining from her face as the second wave arrived. A group of former police officers and highway patrol retirees pulled in uniforms modified with patches, sunglasses, badges on leather vests. One of them tipped his cap to Mrs. Chen, who waved from her front step holding a tray of cookies. Linda stumbled backward toward her porch, phone already in hand. I crossed the lawn, calm and collected. I hadn't worn anything flashy, just jeans, a clean Harley t-shirt, and my leather riding jacket. My face was steady, but inside I could feel the buzz of adrenaline like a hum beneath my skin. "Beautiful morning for a community gathering, isn't it?" I said cheerfully. Linda's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" "Community outreach. Fully permitted. Filed with the city earlier this week. Would have gone through the HOA too, but I didn't think you'd approve of anything not involving overpriced mulch and passive aggression." She blinked at me. "You're not allowed to host. There's no bylaw against community-organized events, Linda. Checked it twice." She opened her mouth to argue, but just then, her phone buzzed. She answered it, muttering something about an emergency situation and outside agitators. I left her to it. As I walked back across the lawn, I saw the news vans roll in 2, then 3. Jane Wong's team was first out of their vehicle. She gave me a subtle nod before turning to her cameraman and issuing crisp instructions. The rest of the neighborhood was waking up quickly now. People were joining the crowd. The Garcias set up a lemonade stand for the riders. Mr. Johnson, who usually complained about everything, had opened his garage and was showing off his rebuilt 50 Harley to a group of impressed young bikers. The Patel kids were handing out flyers about their new school project, engines, and community, the mechanics behind the machines. Linda's spell was breaking in real time. And then, the final nail. At 8:45, a plain gray SUV pulled up and parked quietly near the HOA office. Out stepped a woman in a blazer and glasses, flanked by 2 other people in business attire. One carried a thick briefcase, the other a tripod. It took Linda a moment to notice. She nearly dropped her phone, because standing on the sidewalk was a forensic accountant from the district attorney's office. I'd sent a copy of my evidence file to the week before. The crowd grew quiet as Linda stormed across the street toward me. "You can't do this," she hissed. "You're destroying the peace of this neighborhood." "No," I said calmly. "You did that when you started running it like your personal fiefdom. I've followed the rules." "Always," she snapped, her voice rising. "Which ones?" I asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The real ones? Or the ones you edited in Microsoft Word and uploaded without a vote?" A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. Cameras turned. Jane stepped forward. "Mr. Zaid," she said, holding a mic. "Can you elaborate?" I smiled. "I think the documents will speak for themselves," I said, handing her the folder. Page 1 covers the illegal towing scheme. Page 2, the inflated storage fees. And page 3, that's the fun part, shows the shell company. Linda's husband used to launder payments from the impound lots. The silence was electric. Then a sound from behind Linda. Tom Peterson, Hank's cousin, and the guy who'd handled half the tows in the neighborhood, came stumbling out of his house. "You can't prove any of this," he shouted. Jane flipped to page 4. "Actually, we can." She held up photographs of checks made out to Peterson Recovery Services, co-signed by Linda's husband, then rerouted into a private bank account registered under a different LLC, one that bought up properties under market value after families were hit with towing and legal fees. The crowd erupted not in violence, not in chaos, but in truth. One by one, residents stepped forward. Mrs. Chen spoke first. She'd lost her gardening shed. The Garcias had lost their triumph. Even shy little Kevin Chen held up the documents he'd found at the records office. Each person's voice added weight to the moment. Linda tried to retreat, but everywhere she turned, another neighbor stood between her and the comfort of control. "I'm calling the police," she growled. "Already here," I said, pointing to Officer Rivera, a member of the biker community and one of the first to arrive. He held a cookie in one hand, coffee in the other, nodding calmly. He walked up to Linda. "We'll be taking a look at your financial records, ma'am. And your security footage." Linda's face went blank. Behind her, someone rolled up with a flatbed truck. My Harley was strapped to the back, polished, detailed, and cleaner than the day it left the factory. A banner hung from the front of the trailer, protected by the U.S. Constitution and the CEO of Harley-Davidson. Gasps turned into cheers. I looked Linda in the eye one last time. "You thought I was just a guy with a noisy bike," I said. "You never thought I might be the guy who runs the company." Her mouth opened to say something, but the sound was drowned out by hundreds of engines roaring to life in unison. A sea of chrome and leather, fire and pride. And right in the middle of it all, community. Standing tall, standing together, louder than corruption ever thought we could be. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Sunday afternoon, less than 24 hours after the rally flipped the entire neighborhood on its head. Funny how quickly Linda scrambled to regain control once the spotlight turned against her. But it was too late for damage control. The narrative had already changed. By the time I arrived at the community center, it was standing room only. People spilled out into the hallways, some even watching through the windows. I recognized faces neighbors I'd only exchanged nods with for months now looked at me like they truly saw me for the first time. Old Mr. Johnson, who never left his porch, was sitting up front. The Patels were there with their teenage son. The Garcias sat shoulder to shoulder with Mrs. Chen and Kevin. I even spotted Sarah Wu tucked quietly in the back, a subtle show of support. Linda stood at the front with a clipboard, still clinging to the illusion of authority. She wore a navy blazer over her usual pastel blouse, pearl earrings, and a forced smile so wide it looked like it hurt. Tom Peterson hovered nearby, sweating through his collar, clearly trying not to make eye contact with anyone. Margaret was absent. Not surprising. She was probably halfway to another gated community by now. "Before we begin," Linda said into the mic, "let's all remember to remain civil. This is still a community, and we should treat each other with respect." Respect. That word tasted like ash coming from her. I walked toward the front of the room, calm, deliberate. I wasn't there for revenge. I was there for resolution. For everyone who had been too afraid to speak, too beaten down by fees, fines, and fear. Before Linda could continue, I raised my hand. "Point of order," I said. She paused. "This isn't." Before we begin, I repeated, "I think we need to talk about where all our towing fees have really been going." Someone in the back said, "Amen to that." I stepped to the side of the stage and hooked my laptop into the projector. The screen behind me flickered to life, and I loaded the first file, security footage of my bike being towed in the early morning timestamped, clear as day. The room went still. "This," I said, "is my motorcycle being taken 12 hours before the posted 48-hour window expired. No prior notification, no legal grounds." Linda flinched. Next slide. It was a spreadsheet, columns of names, dates, vehicles towed, fees charged. I highlighted 3 properties, the Garcias, the Martinezes, and the Chen family. Each showed similar patterns: vehicles removed illegally, followed by a string of violations, fines, foreclosure, and finally, transfer of property to a company called Whisper Oaks Holdings. I turned to face the audience. What you're seeing isn't just poor management. It's a system, a cycle of harassment, profit, and property theft disguised as neighborhood policy. The crowd buzzed. Murmurs turned into questions, and questions turned into stories. Mrs. Garcia stood up. "They towed my daughter's car while she was home from college. We paid over $1,200 to get it back. A week later, we got cited for a noise complaint that didn't even happen. Mr. Thompson from 3 doors down raised his voice. My vintage Mustang disappeared while I was in the hospital. They told me I left it abandoned. I'd had that car since I was 22. Even Kevin Chen's quiet voice carried across the room. They fined my grandmother for her garden shed, said it violated building codes. Then they tore it down without warning and billed her for the removal. Linda's composure cracked. She stepped forward, microphone in hand. These are isolated incidents, she said, her voice tight. There's no proof of wrongdoing. I clicked again. Up came scanned checks payments, made from the HOA to Peterson Recovery Services. Each one was signed by Linda or Tom, and each amount was above the state legal limit. Then I showed a bank transfer, a $15,000 payment rerouted from the HOA's account to a personal LLC registered under Linda's husband's name. And finally, the kicker property deeds showing that 3 homes were purchased by that LLC after their previous owners defaulted on HOA fines. This isn't mismanagement, I said. This is racketeering. The room exploded. Voices rose in outrage. The Patels shouted. A woman I didn't recognize stood up holding a file and yelled, "They took my husband's work van!" Linda tried to speak, but her mic was off. Someone had unplugged it. She turned to Tom, who was already backing toward the exit. And then the police officers walked in, same ones from yesterday. They were polite, calm, and serious. They walked up to Linda, handed her a thick envelope, and quietly escorted her away from the podium. She didn't resist. There was no fight left. Tom tried to bolt for the door, but Officer Rivera cut him off. "You'll want to stay," he said. "You're going to want to hear this next part." With Linda gone, I turned to face the board. "I'm not asking for power," I said. "I'm asking for accountability." Susan, the retired teacher who'd once been too afraid to speak up, stood and motioned for a vote. All in favor of removing Linda Ackerman and Tom Peterson from the HOA board, effective immediately, say aye. The room echoed with one unified voice. Aye? No one opposed. It wasn't just a vote, it was an exhale, a letting go of fear, of frustration, of being walked on for too long. When the shouting settled, I stepped up one final time. As a resident, and yes, as the CEO of Harley-Davidson, I'd like to propose something new. I clicked to a slide titled The Unity Initiative, a monthly neighborhood bike show, motorcycle safety classes for teens and seniors, a scholarship fund for young mechanics, and a volunteer program for car maintenance help for anyone who needs it. We've spent too long divided by fake rules and fear. Let's build something better. For a moment, the room was silent again, then applause broke out. Long, loud, and real. People weren't just happy Linda was gone. They were ready for something new. Something honest. As I stepped off the stage, Miss S. Chen reached out and took my hand. "We used to be afraid of her," she said softly. "Now she's afraid of us." I smiled. Not because we'd won, but because we'd finally found our voice. 6 months had passed since the vote. It felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The neighborhood looked different now, not because the houses had changed, but because the people had. You could feel it in the air. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now waved from their porches. The HOA meetings were open, transparent, and usually filled with laughter instead of tension. We had block parties again. Kids played freely in the cul-de-sacs without their parents worrying about mysterious compliance violations. The toxic fear Linda had ruled with was gone, replaced by something simpler and stronger: trust. We turned the community center into something that actually served the community. One half became a shared space for classes and events. The other half? That became a free motorcycle and car maintenance workshop open every Saturday for residents of all ages. It was the same storage building Linda had once used for her secret meetings and private evidence files. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Now it was a place where people brought their bikes, their kids, their curiosity. Local mechanics volunteered. A few former gang members who'd turned their lives around after prison taught basic engine repair. I showed up most weekends myself. even when I could have been in a boardroom or flying to a press event. This was more important. This was home. One Saturday, I was tightening a bolt on a teenager's bike when I got the call. It was from a reporter at a national news network. "We're working on a segment about HOA abuse and grassroots justice movements," she said. "Your neighborhood came up. You mind talking on camera?" I didn't hesitate. I said yes. But before I even had time to process it, something else landed in my inbox. It was an email from a retired judge in Florida. He'd read about our story and recognized a familiar face in one of the viral clips, Linda Ackerman. Apparently, she hadn't moved far, just shifted her operations south to a retirement community where most of the residents were over 70. "She's doing the same thing here," the judge wrote, "only worse. They're terrified of her." He attached copies of forged HOA documents and photos of impounded mobility scooters and oxygen generator violations. It was like déjà vu, only this time the victims were even more vulnerable. I immediately looped in our legal team and called Ray Martinez from the Motorcycle Rights Association. "This isn't just one bad apple," I told him. "It's a system, and we've got to break it." That's how Ride Free, Live Fair was born. We launched the initiative at Harley-Davidson headquarters a month later, an official company-backed program to provide legal support, public advocacy, and financial assistance to homeowners facing HOA harassment nationwide. The first pilot office? Our very own community center. The place that had once symbolized fear now stood as the headquarters of something much bigger. The first check we wrote went to the retirement community in Florida. Within weeks, Linda was under investigation again, this time with a much bigger spotlight on her. At our next monthly Unity Ride, an event we started after the rally, hundreds of residents from across the state joined in. Some rode motorcycles, others brought bikes, skateboards, scooters. Kids, veterans, retirees, all riding side by side. We paraded through our neighborhood with music, cheers, and flags that said things like "community over control" and "justice starts at home." I rode at the front of the pack on my Harley, clean, polished, and shining with the same custom paint I'd chosen the day I bought it. A few feet behind me was Miguel Garcia, riding a newly restored Triumph that looked almost identical to the one he'd lost. When I'd tracked it down at a salvage yard 2 counties over and returned it to him, he cried like a kid on Christmas morning. As we rounded the final bend, I looked around at the people lining the sidewalks. Faces that had once looked down or away now smiled, laughed, clapped. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community. After the ride, we gathered in the community center where I shared some news. "Whisper Oaks Holdings has officially been dissolved," I told the crowd. "The properties they acquired are being investigated for fraud, and for those who lost their homes, we're working with attorneys to pursue restitution." Applause broke out. But that wasn't the big announcement. "I've also spoken to the board at Harley-Davidson," I said. "They've agreed to create a national scholarship fund in the name of our community for young mechanics, veterans transitioning to civilian careers, single parents trying to learn a trade. It's called the Unity Fund, and it starts right here." That brought the house down. I saw Rosa Garcia hugging her husband, Kevin Chen wiping his eyes, Susan, the retired teacher, nodding with pride. Afterward, I walked out into the courtyard and found Mrs. Chen sitting with her grandson, watching the sun dip low over the rooftops. "You know," she said, "I used to think you were just a biker with a loud engine." I smiled. "A lot of people did." "Well," she said, "I'm glad you were." She handed me a small wooden carving, an eagle perched on a motorcycle wheel. "Kevin made it in shop class, said it reminded him of you." I didn't know what to say. I just took it, ran my hand along the smooth edge, and nodded. Sometimes the biggest changes don't come from headlines or corporate memos. Sometimes they come from conversations on porches, tools passed between hands, stories shared between generations. What started with one stolen bike had become a movement, not just to fight injustice, but to build something better in its place. A few days later, a new tow truck drove past my house. But this one had a different logo painted across the side. Community First Towing, protecting people, not profits. I watched it disappear around the corner, then looked down the driveway at my Harley parked right where it belonged. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a gavel or a courtroom. Sometimes it comes with an engine rumble, a neighbor's handshake, and a road wide open ahead. And sometimes the best revenge isn't just about winning. It's about making sure no one else ever has to fight the same battle again. As I look back on everything that happened, the lies, the stolen property, the fear so many of us lived under, I've come to realize this story was never just about a motorcycle. It was about standing up when others sit down, about speaking out when silence becomes too heavy to bear. I've lived long enough to know that power, when left unchecked, will always find new ways to disguise itself, sometimes behind uniforms, sometimes behind rules, and often behind people who smile while doing harm. But I've also learned that community is stronger than control, and that courage doesn't always roar, it often begins with a quiet enough. We may grow older, but we never grow too old to defend what's right. Whether it's our home, our dignity, or our neighbor down the street, it's never too late to push back against injustice. And sometimes, the very thing they use to judge you, like a so-called obnoxious bike, can become the symbol of everything they underestimated. If you've ever felt powerless, remember this: you are never alone. One voice can start a movement, and one small act of defiance can echo farther than you ever imagined. If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's keep the conversation and the courage alive.